They say that cracks in a relationship don't appear with a bang, but with a series of silent hairline fractures you only feel when the whole damn thing finally shatters. For me, the shattering came on a Tuesday, through the casual, pitying voice of my own daughter. But the fractures? Those were a masterpiece of deception, laid over months with the patience of a master craftsman, and I, the old fool, provided the timber and the tools. I'm 74 years old, and I have learned that trust is a currency more fragile than any stock market, and far more devastating when it shatters. This story isn't about the $5,000. Let me be clear on that from the start. The money was just the chisel he used to pry me open. It was the measure he took of my worth, and found it only extended to the contents of my bank account. Now this is about the sculpture he was trying to carve. A doddering old man, a convenient wallet, a punchline. It all started, as the best deceptions do, with warmth. My grandson's visits became more frequent. He'd show up on my porch, that easy smile I'd loved since he was a boy, lighting up his face, a six-pack of imported beer in hand, the kind I'd mentioned liking once, a year ago. "Thought you might want some company, Grandpa," he'd say, and the pleasure that bloomed in my chest was so bright it almost hurt. We'd sit on the back patio, overlooking the garden I'd poured my sweat into since retirement. He'd ask about the roses, the vegetable patch, but then he'd steer the conversation. "Tell me about the factory again, Grandpa, when you started on the floor."
And I would. Oh, God, I would. I'd tell him about the grit under my fingernails, the roar of the machinery that became a symphony of provision, the 30 years of back-breaking work that built the comfortable life I now live. I told him about the pride of an honest day's work, the value of a dollar earned, not given. I was passing the torch. I was a sage on a mountaintop, imparting wisdom to his most promising acolyte. He'd listen, his eyes fixed on me, nodding at all the right places. I felt seen. In a world that increasingly treats the old as ghosts, he made me feel solid, relevant. He called me his favorite grandfather, and I, a man with 2 sons-in-law who were perfectly fine fathers, beamed with a foolish private pride. I thought he saw the man I was, not the man I am now, with creaking joints and a past that grows longer than my future. The first request was small. "Grandpa, my phone bill is insane this month. I went over my data. Can I borrow a couple hundred until payday? It's killing my credit." How could I say no? He was being responsible, trying to protect his credit. I handed him the cash, feeling a surge of patriarchal satisfaction. He was coming to me for guidance, for a safety net. He hugged me, and the gesture felt earned. The cracks were there, I suppose. The payday came and went without a mention of the loan, but I dismissed it. He was young. He forgot. It didn't matter.
Then came the big performance. It was a rainy Thursday evening. He arrived without the six-pack, without the smile. His shoulders were slumped, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked, for all the world, like a young man carrying the weight of it all. He sat in the worn leather armchair across from me, the one his grandmother always used to read, and he put his head in his hands. "It's all falling apart, Grandpa," he murmured, his voice thick with a despair that, I now know, was as real as a $3 bill. The tale unfolded with practiced misery. His rent was 2 months overdue, and his landlord was threatening eviction. His car, a decade-old hatchback, had thrown a rod.
a term I recognized from my own leaner years, and the repair cost was more than the thing was worth. To top it all off, his hours at the tech support job had been slashed. He was looking at living in his broken-down car. My heart broke for him. This was my boy, my pride and joy, facing a desolation I had worked my entire life to ensure my family would never know. The memory of my own childhood, of the cold, drafty house, of the constant, gnawing worry about money, rose up in me like a tide. "How much?" I asked, my voice soft, already reaching for the checkbook in the drawer of the side table, the same checkbook that had bought his childhood bicycles and his high school graduation gift. He looked up, tears shimmering in his eyes. Masterful. 5,000. It would cover everything. Get me back on my feet. I swear, Grandpa, it's a loan. The moment I'm stable, I'll pay you back every cent. I'll set up a payment plan. You have my word." His word. I would have framed it and hung it on the wall then. I believed in his word as I believed in the sunrise. I wrote the check. The pen felt weightless in my hand. I was a hero, a savior. I was preventing a history from repeating itself.
He took the slip of paper, and the transformation was instantaneous. The despair sloughed off him like a second skin. He sprang from the chair, enveloping me in a bear hug that smelled of rain and cheap cologne. Thank you. You're a lifesaver, Grandpa. I'll never forget this." I watched him leave, my heart full to bursting. I had secured my legacy. I had helped my grandson. The silence that followed was the first true note of the coming storm. The phone calls stopped. My messages, friendly, grandfatherly check-ins. How's the job hunt? Is the car running? Went unanswered for a day, then 2, then a week. They were met with brief, generic texts. "Super busy, Grandpa. Talk soon." Or, "Everything's great. Thanks again." The warmth of his gratitude cooled, curdling into a vague unease. But I made excuses for him. He was busy getting his life together. He was working hard. I was being a clinging old man. The fracture became a chasm on that Tuesday. My daughter, his mother, came over for our weekly coffee. She was fidgety, stirring her latte long after the sugar had dissolved. "You seen much of my boy lately?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Oh, you know him. Here and there." "Is he doing okay? With the car and everything?" She put her spoon down with a sharp clink. "Dad, about that." She took a deep breath, and in that pause, I felt the world tilt on its axis. "He's fine. The car's fine. He got a new console, a massive television, a whole gaming setup. Took his girlfriend to the coast for a couple of weekends. He's been laughing about it." The air left my lungs. Laughing about what? Her voice dropped to a whisper, laced with shame. About how easy it was to squeeze cash out of Grandpa.
The words didn't just sting. They were a physical blow, a sucker punch to my soul. Squeeze cash out of Grandpa. The patio, the beer, the stories, the tears. It was all a script, a long con, and I was the mark. The fond memories curdled in an instant, revealed as set pieces in a cruel play.
The pride I'd felt was now a source of deepest humiliation. He hadn't been listening to my stories. He'd been studying his prey. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, my face a mask of calm I was miles from feeling. My daughter apologized, cried, said she'd given him hell, but it was white noise. The only thing I heard was the sound of my own trust breaking. After she left, I sat in the silence of my living room for a long, long time. The grief came first, a raw, aching wound. Then, as the sunset bled across the floorboards, the grief was burned away by a cold, clean, and utterly focused fury. He thought I was just a source of cash, an easy target. It was time to teach my grandson the most expensive lesson of his life. And like all the best lessons, this one would cost him everything. The fury was a cold thing. It didn't rage, it settled. It was the quiet in the house after the door slams, the stillness after the storm has passed and left only wreckage. It was a patient, calculating cold, and it became my constant companion. For 2 days, I moved through my routine like a ghost. I watered the garden, but my hands trembled with a new, sharp energy. I ate my meals, but the food tasted of ash and humiliation. The memory of his laughter, squeeze cash out of Grandpa, echoed in the silence of every room. It was the soundtrack to my newfound clarity. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my narrative. He had taken the story of a hard-working man passing on his legacy and rewritten it as a farce about a gullible old fool.
The grief was a luxury I could not afford. It was a swamp that would suck me down into self-pity. I had been poor once, truly poor, in a way my grandson couldn't conceive of. I had known the hollow ache in my belly and the sharper ache of shame. I had fought my way out of that with grit and graft, and that fighter was still in me. He'd just been lulled to sleep by comfort in the false idol of a grandson's affection. Now the old fighter was awake, and he was pissed. The money, I decided, was the least of it. Taking it back would be a simple transaction, a reversal of a faulty deal. It wouldn't heal the wound. It would just stitch it closed over an infection. No. The lesson had to be more profound. It had to be about the one currency he clearly understood: consequence. I thought about shouting, about a phone call full of rage and recrimination. It would be satisfying for a moment. He would offer weak excuses, or worse, get defensive. Then he would hang up, roll his eyes, and tell his girlfriend that the old man was having another one of his episodes. My anger would become just another anecdote in his story of my irrelevance. That was unacceptable. I needed a confrontation, but not a chaotic one. I needed a stage. I needed an audience. And I needed irrefutable, cold, hard proof. That's when I remembered the document. The week after I'd given him the check, a sliver of my old street-smart self had prickled with unease. It wasn't distrust, I'd told myself then, just prudence. When he'd come over, all smiles and gratitude, I'd casually slid a single sheet of paper across the kitchen table. "Just a formality, kid," I'd said, affecting a tone of world weariness. "Helps an old man keep his ducks in a row." It was a simple loan agreement. The amount, the date, a line that stated it was a personal loan to be repaid in full within a year. No interest. It was a gentle, grandfatherly nudge toward responsibility.
He glanced at it, chuckled a little, and without a second thought scrawled his signature on the dotted line. "No problem, Grandpa. Whatever you need." He'd seen it as a piece of pointless bureaucracy, the eccentricity of an aging man. I'd seen it as a token of his good faith. We were both wrong. It was a snare, and he had willingly placed his foot in it. I found the document in my filing cabinet, tucked between my homeowner's insurance policy and my will. His signature, a messy, confident scrawl, now looked like a confession. It was my first weapon. The next day I put on my best suit, the one I wore to funerals and my wife's memorial. It hung a little looser on my frame than it used to. I drove downtown to a small, unassuming office where a man named Mr. Abrams had handled my legal affairs for the past 20 years. He was a quiet man, with eyes that missed nothing. I laid it all out for him, the deception, the betrayal, the mocked laughter. I showed him the check copy and the signed loan agreement. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremor I felt inside. I was stating facts, building a case. Mr. Abrams listened, his fingers steepled. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Morally, he's a thief. Legally, with this document, he's a debtor in default. We can file in small claims court. The maximum is $10,000, so we're well within the limit. With this evidence, he has no defense. The court will almost certainly rule in your favor and grant a garnishment order. "I don't just want the money," I said, my voice low and firm. "I want it to come directly from his paycheck. I want his employer to know. I want every payment to feel like a scrape of a knife." Mr. Abrams gave me a long, appraising look. He saw the cold fire in my eyes. "Understood," he said simply. "We'll prepare the filing. We can have it ready to serve in about 3 weeks." "Perfect," I said. "His birthday is in a month. There's a family dinner at my house." A flicker of understanding passed between us. He didn't smile, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. He saw the blueprint of my revenge, and he gave a slight, professional nod of approval. The following weeks were a study in controlled tension. I became a director, meticulously preparing my stage. I called my daughter, and in a voice I worked hard to keep light and grandfatherly, insisted on hosting the birthday dinner. "I want to do something special for him," I said, the lie smooth as silk on my tongue. I cleaned the house. I planned the menu, his favorite foods, the ones his grandmother used to make. I even bought a gaudy, oversized birthday card and had the whole family sign it. I played my part to perfection. The forgiving, doting grandfather, too sweet and simple to hold a grudge. Inside, I was a coil of wire, tightening day by day. The night of the dinner arrived. The house was filled with the warm, savory scent of roasted meat and baking bread. Laughter and the clatter of cutlery echoed through the rooms. My family was all there. My daughter, her husband, my other grandchildren, aunts, uncles. They were the backdrop, the witnesses I required. And then there was him. He arrived late, with a flourish, his arm around his girlfriend. He was glowing with the invincible confidence of youth that has never truly been tested. He accepted the backslaps and the happy birthdays, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He gave me a wide, easy smile,
the same one he'd used when he'd been lying to my face. "Grandpa," he boomed, crossing the room to clap me on the shoulder. "The place looks great, smells amazing. You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble." Oh, but I should have, I thought. It was absolutely necessary. "No trouble at all," I said, my own smile feeling like a crack in a sheet of ice, "for my favorite grandson."
The words, which had once filled me with such genuine warmth, now felt like an incantation, sealing his fate. He beamed, utterly oblivious, and moved on to accept a beer from his father. I watched him throughout the meal. He held court, telling animated stories about his job, his friends, his life, a life funded by my naivety. He was the star of his own show, and he had no idea the curtain was about to fall. My daughter caught my eye from across the table. Hers were filled with a quiet, anxious question. She knew I knew. She had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. I gave her a small, calm nod and looked away. This was not her moment. Finally, the plates were cleared. The time for dessert had arrived. The conversation was a warm, buzzing hum. It was time. "All right, everyone," I announced, pushing back my chair with a quiet scrape that cut through the noise. "Time for the birthday boy to open his present from me." A ripple of cheerful anticipation went around the table. He rubbed his hands together, a boyish gesture that once would have melted my heart. "You didn't have to, Grandpa, but I'm not going to stop you." There was a wave of laughter. I walked to the sideboard where I had placed the package. It was a box, about the size of a shirt box, wrapped in gaudy, celebratory paper, covered in cartoon balloons and confetti. I had taken great care with the wrapping. The presentation was key. I carried it over and set it before him with a sense of ceremony. The family leaned in, smiling. "Go on, then," I said, my voice steady. "Open it." He tore into the paper with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child, ripping the bright paper to shreds. He lifted the lid off the box, an expectant grin on his face, ready to feign delight at whatever sweater or tool set lay within. His grin froze. Then it dissolved slowly, like sugar in cold water.
The box was empty except for a single, pristine, white sheet of paper. A confused murmur went around the table. His girlfriend giggled nervously. "Is it a prank, Grandpa?" He reached in, his brow furrowed in confusion, and pulled out the paper. His eyes scanned it. I saw the moment of recognition, the moment the world he knew tilted and began to slide into the abyss. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. It was a copy of the loan agreement. At the top, in bold red letters, were the words, "Notice of default and intent to sue." His head snapped up, his eyes wide and suddenly, beautifully terrified. "You're not serious," he stammered, his voice a dry croak. The room fell utterly silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence was my amplifier. I stood up, my old bones straightening, my posture squaring into that of the man I used to be, the foreman, the provider, the unyielding force. I looked down at him not with anger, but with a terrifying, glacial
calm. "You taught me my kindness was a joke to you. Now you'll learn what it feels like to be held accountable." The silence in the room was now absolute, a physical weight. You could have heard a dust mote settle. I continued. "The court papers were filed yesterday. With the evidence, you don't stand a chance. You will pay me back every cent with court costs. It will be garnished directly from your paycheck until the debt is settled." I let that hang in the air. Let the word garnished sink into the minds of his parents, his siblings, his girlfriend. Let them all understand the public financial humiliation that awaited him.
He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The golden boy was tarnished, exposed as a fraud in front of the entire family. The favorite grandpa act was dead. In its place stood a judge, a jury, and an executioner, all wrapped in the familiar, terrifying skin of an old man who had finally decided to stop being nice. The lesson had begun. The silence that followed my declaration was the most profound sound I have ever heard. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was a presence. It was heavy, thick, and vibrating with the shock that radiated from every person seated at my dining table. The festive tableau of minutes before, the gleaming silverware, the half-eaten slices of chocolate cake, the colorful balloons tied to the back of his chair, was now frozen. A museum exhibit titled "The Moment Everything Changed." My grandson, I will not use his name, for the boy I thought he was no longer exists, stared at the paper in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. His knuckles were white, the paper trembling in his grip. The confident, charismatic young man had evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of panic. It was my daughter, his mother, who broke the silence. Her voice was a strangled whisper. "Dad, what is this? What's going on?" I did not look away from him. "Why don't you explain it to your mother?" I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "Tell her about the loan, the one you needed for your overdue rent and your broken-down car. Or perhaps," I continued, leaning forward slightly, "you could tell her what you really spent it on. I believe a new gaming console was mentioned, and weekend trips to the coast." A collective, sharp intake of breath circled the table. His girlfriend, seated beside him, recoiled slightly, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. She hadn't known. Of course she hadn't. He'd probably told her he'd gotten a bonus. "Grandpa, please," he begged, his voice cracking. He looked like a little boy again, but this time the sight inspired no pity. "We can talk about this. I can pay you back. I swear, just not like this." "We are not talking," I stated, the finality in my tone as solid as a slamming door. "You had months to talk. You had months to pick up the phone. You chose instead to laugh. The time for talking is over. Now there is only the law." His father, my son-in-law, a pragmatic and stern man I'd always respected, found his voice. "Is this true, son?" The question was low, guttural, loaded with a disappointment so deep it seemed to bow his shoulders. The boy, I cannot call him a man, not after this, could only manage a helpless, jerky nod. his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. The room erupted, not in shouts, but in a frantic, hushed tumult of questions and accusations. "You lied to Grandpa? You used him? All those visits? Was it just for money?" The veneer of the perfect family was stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. He was isolated in the center of it, his secret laid bare for all to see. This was the true cost, far beyond the financial. This was the loss of his standing, his credibility, the unconditional trust of his family. I stood my ground, a rock in the churning sea of their emotions. I watched as the reality of the garnishment sank in for his father, a man who had worked his entire life in middle management and understood the profound shame of having your financial failures laid bare to your employer. "They'll take it straight from his check?" he asked me, his voice hollow. "Until the debt, plus court fees, is repaid in full. It's a matter of public record once the judgment is entered." The birthday dinner was over. The celebration was dead. People began to stand, gathering purses and jackets in a stunned, hurried silence. There were no goodbyes. My daughter was crying, torn between fury at her son and a devastating grief for what he had done, for what I had done in return. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to recant, to reveal this was all some monstrous joke.
I met her gaze, and I let her see the unyielding truth in mine. There was no comfort to be found here. Within 10 minutes the house was empty, save for the wreckage of the meal and the two of us. He still sat in his chair, the notice of default crumpled in his fist. The sound of the last car pulling away was like the period at the end of a dreadful sentence. He finally looked up at me. The fear was still there, but it was now mingled with the hot, juvenile anger. "You humiliated me," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "In front of everyone. Was it worth it? For $5,000? And there it was, the final definitive proof that he had learned nothing, that he still saw this as being about the money. I walked around the table until I was standing beside him. I looked down at him, not as a grandfather, but as a creditor, as an adversary. "No," I said, my voice soft but sharp as a razor. "I did not humiliate you. You humiliated yourself the moment you decided my love was a commodity you could exploit. I merely held up a mirror. You humiliated yourself when you concocted a story and looked me in the eye and lied. I merely presented the evidence. You humiliated yourself when you laughed at my trust. I have simply ceased to be a laughing matter." I placed my hands on the table, leaning in close. This was never about the $5,000. It was about the 5,000 moments of disrespect. It was about the value of a promise. It was about teaching you that every action, especially those you think are hidden, has a consequence. You thought you were smart. You thought you were playing a game. I have just shown you the rules you didn't know existed. I straightened up. The court date is in 3 weeks. I suggest you find a lawyer, though I doubt it will help. I left him there, sitting in the ruins of his own character. I walked into the kitchen and began methodically cleaning the dishes, the clatter of porcelain and silver the only sound in the house. I heard his chair scrape back,
heard his footsteps stumble to the door, and heard it open and close with a quiet, definitive click.
The house was truly silent now, and for the first time since my daughter had spoken the truth, the cold fury inside me began to thaw, not into warmth, but into a profound and weary satisfaction. The first act was over. The legal process that followed was a dry, anticlimactic affair. He did not get a lawyer. He showed up to the small claims court hearing looking haggard and much younger than his 23 years. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with tired eyes, reviewed the loan agreement, the copy of the cashed check, and the evidence of his spending I had gathered from his own social media posts. Pictures of the new television, the gaming console, the beachfront hotel. It took less than 15 minutes. The judgment was entered against him. The garnishment order was signed. It was over. The money, as I knew it would, began to appear in my account in small, automated increments every 2 weeks. Each deposit was a silent, electronic echo of his downfall. But the real payment, the one I was truly waiting for, was slower in coming. Weeks turned into months. The family, initially fractured, began to find a new, cautious equilibrium. My daughter was cool with me for a time, mourning the loss of the peaceful family dynamic. But she was a good woman, and deep down she knew her son had been the architect of this chaos. Slowly, tentatively, our weekly coffees resumed. We didn't speak of him. It was a wound we let scab over in silence. I heard snippets, of course. The garnishment had forced him to move out of his apartment and back into his parents' basement. The fancy gaming setup was sold. The girlfriend, unable to reconcile the charismatic boy she knew with the exposed liar he was, eventually left. The consequences were rippling through his life exactly as I had intended. He was experiencing the very hardship he had so artfully faked to manipulate me. I went about my life. I tended my garden. I read my books. I met with old friends for lunch. But a part of me was always waiting, watching. The revenge was complete, but the lesson, I was not yet sure it had been learned.
Then, one rainy Saturday afternoon, about 5 months after the birthday dinner, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there he stood. He was alone. He looked older. The boyish softness was gone from his face, replaced by a leaner, harder edge. He was holding a small, nervous-looking plant in a plastic pot, a lavender bush. He met my eyes, and for the first time in over a year, he didn't look away. There was no easy smile, no glib charm. There was only a stark, unvarnished seriousness. "Grandpa," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "can I come in?" I said nothing, simply stepped aside and held the door open. He walked in, wiping his feet meticulously on the mat. He held out the plant. "For your garden. I remember you said the last one didn't make it through the winter." I took it. It was a thoughtful gift, the first he had ever given me that required him to remember something about me rather than what he could get from me. I led him to the living room. He didn't sprawl in the armchair as he used to. He sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped between his knees. The silence stretched, but it was different from the terrible silence of the dinner. This was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of someone gathering the courage to speak a difficult truth. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he began, still looking at his hands. "And I'm not here to make excuses. There aren't any." He took a deep breath. "I was a selfish, entitled bastard. I saw your generosity as a weakness. I saw your stories as a price of admission. I thought I was so clever." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were clear, devoid of the old manipulation. I was an idiot. What you did, at the dinner with the court, it broke me, and it needed to. The garnishment, every time I see that line item on my pay stub, I remember. I remember what I did, I remember what I lost.
He paused, swallowing hard. I lost the family's respect. I lost my girlfriend. I had to move back home like a child. But most of all, I lost you. Not the favorite grandpa I invented to get what I wanted. I lost the real you. The man who worked his way up from nothing. The man who tried to teach me about integrity. I wasn't listening then, but I am now. He leaned forward, his expression raw with a sincerity I had never seen in him before. The money will be paid back. That's the law. But I can never pay back what I took from you. I understand that now. I needed you to know that I see it. I see the man you are. And I am so sorry. I looked at him, this young man sitting in my living room, and for the first time I saw not my pride and joy, nor a conniving villain, but simply a fallible human being who had taken a terribly wrong path and was finally finding his way back. I didn't hug him. I didn't forgive him outright. Some wounds are too deep for a simple absolution. Trust, once shattered, doesn't reform in a moment. It gathers like a glacier, millimeter by millimeter, over a long, cold season. But I nodded, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. Thank you for the plant. It should do well in the corner by the fence. It was not a pardon, but it was a door, left slightly ajar. He visits now, once every few weeks. The visits are quieter. He doesn't bring beer or empty flattery. Sometimes he asks me a question about the factory, about managing men, and I can tell he's actually listening to the answer. He looks me in the eye. There is a weight to him that wasn't there before, the weight of consequence, the weight of earned humility.
The money is almost repaid. The lesson, however, is ongoing. He is learning the value of a dollar earned through sweat, and I am learning the shape of a relationship rebuilt, not on the soft sand of indulgent affection, but on the hard, unyielding rock of truth. Sometimes revenge isn't about anger. It's about teaching a spoiled kid that loyalty is worth more than a gaming console. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, the student actually learns.